This is the Hope Not Note podcast,
where we answer your questions and share inspirational stories to fill your soul with hope.
Our mission is to empower hope to those who have been plagued by note.
I'm Dr. Dylan Caswell.
And I'm Brandy.
And we're here to bring you out of the note and into hope.
Welcome to the Hope Not Note podcast. We are so excited to have you listening to this episode. How are you doing today, Dylan?
Doing great. How are you doing?
I'm doing great.
We learned that having a great day is a
choice.
It's a choice.
It's a choice. Whenever I was in middle school, our guidance counselor did the announcements at the beginning of the day, and he would always say, make it a great day or not. The choice is yours.
It's so true. So true.
All right, let's dive into our question. Mm-hmm. Our listener named Rachel asked this question. She said, I was watching CrossFit athlete Luke Parker behind the scenes video on YouTube. He's with CrossFit Mayhem. And he was putting baking soda in his coffee and telling the viewers that the science shows that the baking soda helps with performance. So the question is, what is the science behind this baking soda trend?
Great question. Do you want to give him background of who Luke Parker is?
Sure.
Aside from CrossFit?
Yeah, so Luke Parker is a CrossFit athlete. He's been to the games twice, I believe, and then was also on a team. But years ago, he was actually one of the contestants on The Bachelorette and made it to being in the Final Four, which was crazy. I don't really watch The Bachelor or The Bachelorette, but that one season, I've seen 2 seasons, and they were both because my friends wanted like a weekly hangout, and so we would hang out together and watch it. So that was one of the only seasons I've actually watched. So whenever I started getting into CrossFit, I was like, wait, I know that guy. So such a small world. But now he's married. He actually just a few weeks after the CrossFit Games this past year, his wife had a baby, and so it's been cool like following him on social media and seeing him become a father and things like that. But he is a CrossFit Mayhem athlete, lives and trains in Cookeville, Tennessee. So Luke Parker, this episode, I guess, is for you. But we'll see what the science says about this trend.
For Luke Parker, the other CrossFit athletes that we've seen using baking soda or sodium bicarbonate know that sodium bicarbonate is baking soda. So that when we dive into the research, that you know that these words are the same. There's not sodium bicarbonate is baking soda. Baking soda is sodium bicarbonate. And this isn't just in CrossFit. You know, it's in cycling, it's in running, it's in lift, it's in a lot of different sports. The thought behind supplementing with baking soda, and a lot of people, they'll just put it into their coffee, they put it into their drink, and then they just sip it down. The thought behind baking soda is that it improves performance. And this isn't something that's newer that's been studied. I think it's something newer that people are starting to get more awareness about because athletes are using it and saying, hey, I use this, go check out the science. And what ends up happening when we see professional athletes using supplements? We then, as general population athletes, go, oh, that's what I should be doing, right? And when we look at human performance, which could be a whole nother episode, supplements are the last part of the equation. Like that last little 1 to 2 to 3% increase. There's so many other building blocks that we can take care of before we ever get to the conversation of supplements. So in human performance, to me, most of the time with general population, let's take away some supplements, spend more time building up to competition demands, and then supplementing once the building blocks are there, which we'll dive into that, I think, through the episode, because it's a very loaded answer. It's a very loaded answer. But in short, athletes will use it for performance. And it's not a new thing that's been studied. It's been studied since the 1920s, the 1970s. And then it got really popular after 2011 when Amelia Carr and their colleagues, they released a meta-analysis looking at sodium bicarbonate supplementation. And they found in cyclists that it improved their performance 1 to 3%. It was like 1% with a standard deviation of 2.7. So they said 1 to 3% range of improved performance in cyclists that were found in the meta-analysis. So then it got more popular of like, oh, we should be using this. But the general thought is that it improves performance in activities that last between 30 seconds up to 12 minutes. That's kind of what the positional statements will say is 30 seconds up to 12 minutes. Other than that, there has been some research now looking at longer duration, like 30-minute based exercises. And at first glance shows that, yeah, this might be a ergogenic performance enhancer. Ergogenic meaning that you're taking it and it's improving your performance. Ergolytic means that you take it and it has some consequences of taking it. So there are some ergogenic benefits at first glance when looking at the science.
Gotcha. So like how does it work then specifically?
Yeah, it's a complex scenario that I have to dive back into my exercise science degree from the University of Syracuse.
The University of Syracuse. You're like on the football, like you're being announced at the beginning of the game or whatever. The University of Syracuse.
University of Syracuse. So we see, again, at first glance in the research that it seems to improve performance between this period of 30 seconds to 12 minutes. And the way that that could potentially be happening is we have to understand the energy systems that allow us to exercise. So there's 3 energy systems: phosphocreatine, anaerobic glycolytic, and the aerobic system. Phosphocreatine is incredibly fast. It's anywhere from 0 seconds up to an 8 to 10 second activity. That's the phosphocreatine system that is helping to aid in that performance. Past that, then we start to get into anaerobic glycolytic systems. What that means is that glucose or carbs, why we need carbs for performance. If you're an athlete, you need carbs or else you're not utilizing the system. But in this window of after 10 seconds or so up until, well, it depends on intensity, but the anaerobic glycolytic system starts to take over. In that system, ATP is used to break down glucose, and in that, it takes 2 ATPs to do that, but then you get a net gain of 2 ATPs after that. So it creates 2 ATPs to break it down, and then you get 4 ATPs. So it's a net of 2 ATPs. ATP is needed for energy. It's needed to fuel. It's a fuel substrate to keep us going. In that reaction, when the ATP is going through and doing this, it creates this molecule called pyruvate. Pyruvate can then either go into further oxidation to be used for energy through a molecule called NADH, or that pyruvate can now turn to lactate. But in these conversions, what ends up happening is that hydrogen ions are branched off of the pyruvate. Long story to say that lactate is the thing that we're looking at, and hydrogen ion accumulation. And that gets into the concept of the idea of lactic acid burn. Like we've all felt that, and we've termed like the burning sensation in my muscle groups. That's lactic acid. That's in there. It's not lactic acid. It's lactate. And the lactate doesn't cause the burning. The accumulation of hydrogen ions does create that burning. And that's an important discrepancy, because to the layperson, it may not matter, right? Because it makes sense in our brain, confirmation bias, when we see lactic acid. Oh, acid burns. This burns, must be lactic acid. But from a science perspective, that term is completely inaccurate. There are 2 different substrates. In fact, one researcher showed that humans do not create lactic acid, that cows do, but humans do not. So again, the human body, when it's in this anaerobic glycolytic state, it is making pyruvate that's then converted to lactate and hydrogen ions. The accumulation of hydrogen ions is what creates that burning sensation. Now, when we have an accumulation of hydrogen ions, that changes our body's pH. pH is a measure of the acidity and the acidosis and the alkalosis of our body, so acidic or basic. The normal human range is 7.35 to 7.45. When we start to get out of that range, what ends up happening is oxidative metabolism starts to be altered, meaning the ability to deliver oxygen to the rest of the body, the ability to saturate hemoglobin with oxygen. That starts to change under acidic conditions. So the thought is, when we have an increase in hydrogen ions, these hydrogen ions create a more acidic environment. And what ends up happening is all this is happening inside the muscle cell. Once that muscle cell becomes too full, it has no choice but to take the lactate, the hydrogen ions, and leak it to the bloodstream. Once it's in the bloodstream, this is where we start to get the idea of like a lactate threshold. How good are your clearing capabilities to keep performing when lactate is being shoveled around the system and hydrogen ions are trying to be buffered? So the lactate, we look at lactate and lactate threshold as being like a bad thing. But when we understand the difference that it's lactate and not lactic acid, we now know that lactate is shuttled to different parts of the body, one being the liver, in which that can be now converted to glycogen and then broken down to be used for more energy to keep fueling us. But lactate is a beautiful substance. It allows us to keep performing. It's the ability to buffer the hydrogen ions that'll allow us to not feel as much of the burn or to keep pushing in that burn. So then the hydrogen ion, the more hydrogen we have, the lower the pH level becomes, the more acidic the body's becoming. So the idea is that, long way to get back to the answer.
I was going to say, so how is baking soda connected to this?
Long way to get back to the answer is the idea is that the sodium bicarbonate is a buffer to the hydrogen ion. Meaning that if there's an accumulated hydrogen ion, but there's something to buffer it, then the environment won't become as acidic. The pH level will stay more towards a alkalosis or alkaline state versus an acidic state. If we're more in that alkaline state, then muscle performance can continue to keep happening. So the idea is that by consuming the sodium bicarbonate, it gets into these areas and it buffers the hydrogen ions, specifically in this anaerobic glycolytic phase of exercise. So I want to kind of summarize that because there's a lot of myths that are debunked in that answer. One, it's not lactic acid that brings on the burning sensation. It is lactate and then the accumulation of hydrogen ions that give us the burning. Lactate is a needed substrate that can be used for further fueling. The other thing I want to bring up is we talked about these three energy systems: phosphocreatine, anaerobic glycolytic system, and the aerobic system, which I don't know if I mentioned that, but the third one is the aerobic system. And that's more of our oxidative metabolism that yields the most amount of ATP, the most amount of energy molecules. These three systems are needed. It's not, we hear these three systems and I gave the time frames and we start to believe that like, oh, after 10 seconds, this system shuts down and then the anaerobic system comes on. And then after 12 minutes, the anaerobic system shuts off and then it becomes all oxidative. There's no shut on, shut off. Like these systems are all working interchangeably. It's just what one is able to yield the most amount of ATP, what one is able to allow us to keep working given the intensity that we're working at. For the aerobic system to dominate after 12 minutes, the intensity of the exercise needs to be really low, like really low in order to keep that. So if we have a steady state and then a spike, we're kind of aerobic dipping into anaerobic, right? But if we're just at this steady state throughout, then it's more of the aerobic. So in terms of sodium bicarbonate supplementation or baking soda supplementation, it's been found that it can create a performance effect at first glance when it is in that duration that's using the anaerobic glycolytic phase, because that's where the hydrogen ions are being accumulated, and that the sodium bicarbonate can be a buffer to it in that phase.
Okay, so you keep saying at first glance though, which makes me think that you did not stay at first glance and you dove in deeper. So explain.
Yes. So like I said in the beginning, this is research that has been around for a while and it's become more advanced, but in the advancement, there's been a lot of inconsistencies with this research. So there's been a lot of different findings, a lot of different methodologies that have been used. And again, at first glance, when you look at studies before 2023, you'll see that there are performance enhancements that happen. And you will see this happening in randomized, double-blinded randomized controlled trials with a placebo, right? We've mentioned that before on this podcast, that those are the studies you want to look at to see, is this something that I should supplement with?
Those are the ones that are most trustworthy.
The most trustworthy. Because they're being compared to a control or a placebo, and the person is not supposed to know which intervention group that they're in. They're not supposed to know if they're getting the placebo or if they're getting the substance that's being studied.
Right. So in this case, like, for example, it's a group of however many people, and they all have a glass of water, and they don't know if there's like baking soda in the glass of water or not. They're just drinking it and then going to perform.
Exactly. Yep. And that's where we can pick up the conversation, is that's what's supposed to happen. But what researchers have found, this article came out in 2023, Wilger and al. They found that how the blinding of the substance specific to baking soda is delivered matters in the research, because the typical way that they would do this is they put the baking soda in a cup, in a liquid, and it would be like a squash dilution, so that like the color of the placebo and the baking soda would be the same. And then they put like sodium chloride in the other one, or like just salt, because if you've ever consumed baking soda like with water or in coffee, it has a unique taste. It has like a bitter, salty aftertaste. And so some of this early research, what we're now learning from this study in 2023, is that the best way to blind subjects to are they getting sodium bicarbonate or a placebo so that they don't know is through a capsule, not through a drink. And what they found in this research is not only is that the best way to blind it, but they found that they looked at people having it, and then they marked their thoughts. Did I have the sodium bicarbonate or did I have the placebo? And when they had the drink, they were able to identify which one they had. And when they're able to identify which one they had, their performance changed completely on cycling trials. So their perception of having it is what led to the performance outcomes and the buffering of the pH levels that we talked about earlier. Not that they actually had sodium bicarbonate, but the thought that they knew that they had it. So how did they know that it was a thought that was driving that? Because in the group that had the capsules that were not they weren't able to identify that this was sodium bicarbonate, or the placebo group, there was no significant difference between the two, although the exact level was the same between the two. So the perceptual response of I'm having this thing that I may or may not know is supposed to help my performance led them to actually performing and working harder on the test than those that didn't think or weren't able to decipher between it. So then we go back to all the previous performance studies, and we see most of the time they were consuming it. So now we have
in a liquid.
In a liquid.
Yeah.
So now it brings up the question of, like right now, the position statements say that sodium bicarbonate does improve performance in activities lasting between 12 seconds to or 30 seconds to 12 minutes. It does say that we should use this dosage of 0.2 to 0.3 grams per kilogram of body weight. And that's the dosage that should be used, which, quick side note with that positional statement as well, people are trying to identify, like, where did that number come from?
Right.
The 0.2 to 0.3 grams per kilogram of body weight. And where it came from was a research done in 1970 something. And that study had 9 individuals, which is a very low sample size. And with those 9 individuals, they were non-athletic in the sense of, like, they weren't trained. They weren't recreational athletes. They were untrained individuals that consumed this amount and likely showed a performance effect. So all the research after that stayed at that 0.2 to 0.3 gram per kilogram.
Has been off of 9 people.
Off of 9 people.
Oh my goodness.
And then, so like from that though, like that being used in each study, that dosage, the other thing that's been found is there's huge variability of when the performance effect can happen. A window of 40-minute difference between, like, for example, you have sodium bicarbonate, I have sodium bicarbonate. The difference in variability of when that performance effect could happen for you or for I is at a minimum 40 minutes. So like the loading range of it in the position statement is super wide because of the variability. And then we look at other studies of variability, and one, Schoenfield et al., they looked at, because this has mainly been looked at in cycling trials. So they looked at like resistance training. What happens if we compare this with bench pressing versus like bicep curls in trained individuals? And they did 3 trials of it because they wanted to see not just the first trial, but over time, over 3 trials, how does that impact the performance? And they found in the group that was taking sodium bicarbonate that their bench press performance improved in the second and third trial compared to the first trial compared to the control or the placebo. But it had no impact on bicep curls with the same design and the same subjects. So why does it have an effect on bench press, but it doesn't have an effect on bicep curls? Is it more muscle mass being used? Like there's so many variability within this. And then, looking back at different things of like, well, how is a supplement being taken? Like, is it being taken with caffeine, right? Because caffeine is like a known performance or ergogenic performance enhancer. So if we're putting baking soda in the coffee, is it really just the coffee and the caffeine that's aiding the performance, or is it the baking soda that's helping with it? And in that, there's actually a study done in CrossFit, and they use the workout Cindy. So Cindy is 20 rounds of 5 pull-ups, 10 push-ups, and 15 air squats. 20 rounds of that. It generally it will take around, for really good athletes, 16 minutes up to 25 minutes. And again, like if you're not wearing a vest, it'll be a little bit faster. If you're wearing a vest, it'll be a little bit longer.
Is it strict pull-ups too? Or is it
it's skipping pull-ups. Yep. And it's basically like, it's a good trainer for getting ready for Murph, right?
Yeah.
Like a mile run, and then you look at the 20 rounds, and that volume is the same volume that's done in Murph, and then you go for the next run. So it's a good training to get up for there, but it's a benchmark workout in CrossFit. So they looked at CrossFitters, and they had them perform Cindy. They had them perform it with caffeine, with coffee. Then they had them perform it with caffeine and baking soda. And then they had them perform it with just baking soda. And then they had them perform it with nothing. And it was super interesting. How much
time was in between all these trials?
Oh, there was a washout period that happened. And they were randomized in different orders to minimize training effect.
Gotcha.
Right? Because well,
that's what I was thinking.
Right. Like everyone's going to get better by the 4th trial because of just practicing it and improving more fitness. But it was done in a way that, like, at each time a person was getting a different supplement that they didn't know which one they were getting.
Yeah.
Because again, like, that's the hard part with this research is like, for example, like icing something. Like, how do you provide a placebo ice to someone? Like, that you're getting it, or that you're not getting it.
Right.
So it's when you're tasting it, when it's a sensation, it's hard. But anyway, in the study, they found that there was no performance benefit in the caffeine and the caffeine baking soda and the baking soda compared to the control, meaning that the times were not significantly different between the two. But what they did find is that their RPE, their rating of perceived exertion, which is a subjective perception of how hard was that work, the RPE was significantly lower in the groups that had caffeine, sodium bicarbonate, and sodium bicarbonate compared to the control. But what's interesting is in those 3 conditions, their max heart rate was also higher. So to paint this out, objectively, we have a higher max heart rate, but a lower rating perceived exertion.
Yeah.
That's really confusing.
Yeah, very.
Because if my heart rate's higher, then I should have the perception that my work that was done was higher. But there's a difference between those two.
Right.
But the outcome wasn't a change in max performance of that particular workout. And I think why they chose Cindy is it's kind of on that line of like steady state, but then some sprints at the end. In the sense of like, to do well on Cindy, you kind of find a good pace for the first 15 rounds. And in the last 5 rounds, you start to push it really hard. Some can push it a little bit sooner, some will push it a little bit later, but you get the steady state within the spike into the anaerobic system and then back down. So you are getting the hydrogen ion accumulation, the lactate.
Yeah. Would it have made more sense for them to have chosen a workout that was more between 30 seconds and 12 minutes rather than something that was longer?
I think so. And I don't know specifically why Cindy was chosen other than like the ease of access of doing it. Like, it's probably there's less barriers to entry compared to like DT and like weight variables. Like, you have a couple subjects doing DT, which is 5 rounds of 12 deadlifts, 9 hang cleans, 6 shoulder overheads,
Right.
And you have someone doing it at RX and then someone doing it scaled and
Right. Where Cindy is like all body.
It's all body
Yes, there's
weight.
pull-ups, but like it's all body weight.
Right.
So,
Right.
Another question, unless you have something more to say on that, but I know that we're talking primarily about taking sodium bicarbonate, but isn't there like a moisturizer or lotion that you can use as well?
Yeah, so in the theme of CrossFit, and I haven't seen this done in the cycling community. Doesn't mean it hasn't been done.
Right.
So our runners and cyclers and CrossFitters will probably be able to relate to this, but we have seen athletes spreading baking soda lotion all over their body prior to an event. And the question becomes like, okay, is the lotion have a similar effect as ingesting it? And there actually has been research done on it, and the short answer is no, it's not. Like, the lotion does not have the same potential benefits as ingesting it does. If there is a benefit with the lotion, we do know that it is a perception that changes the performance, because what they do in these studies, which is really cool, is they do actually look at the blood pH and they see, does the blood pH change? And the answer is it does change when sodium bicarbonate is ingested. The lotion didn't change it, because why? That has to penetrate through all these layers of skin, through the muscles, to then get into the vasculature to be able to be systemically mobilized around the system. And with a lotion or a cream for that matter, like, that's not happening. Even if it says deep penetrating agent, like, it's not getting that deep into the skin to be able to circulate around. So the lotion, can there be a performance effect? Yes. But is it likely due to perception? Yes, because there's not these changes that are seen in pH levels and the other things that are seen when it is ingested. But to that point, when we're talking about, well, how is it ingested, right? Is it in the capsule in research, or is it in the liquid? The research that was done in 2023 that we referenced a little bit earlier, they did speculate that the buffering and the pH that was happening could also be perception driven, because we're looking at this from a muscle cell level. That a good analogy that I read is, assume that you have a cup, and in this cup, this is the muscle cell, and inside of this, right, the processes are happening, and the anaerobic glycolysis is happening. So the lactate, the hydrogen ions are accumulating. That's like dumping water into this cup. If that keeps accumulating, what's going to happen? That water has to come outside of the cup, and then it has to get into other areas in the bloodstream. And that's what's happening. This is all happening in the muscle cell, but then it keeps happening, and then it spills out to go across the bloodstream. So then you can look at pH level and see like, how much did this actually delay the acidity of the pH level? How much did this delay that happening? How much did it delay the cessation of exercise from getting into that environment? And so that's what they look at. But again, that's within the muscle cell. But what drives muscle contraction? What drives performance? The motor pathways from the brain and the spinal cord going down to these areas. So could the perception of this thing change the buffering capacities and the pH levels of that? Well, the researchers are like, yeah, that can happen, because that could also happen in the placebo group. So it's a very interesting dynamic of sodium bicarbonate for how much research has been done on it, but then looking at it and saying, yeah, there's inconsistent results, and the blinding wasn't done to the way that would mitigate the effects of perception changing the performance.
Correct. Yeah. So my biggest takeaway is that most of the research prior to 2023 is flawed. Even though it's like the most trustworthy research there could be, it's still flawed in the way, because of the way in which they chose to blind the parties that were being tested. Which brings up the question, like, why do we need these different supplements that are not proven in order to reach our athletic potential?
Yeah,
we don't.
We don't.
Like, we don't.
And I can see why, like, the top 1% of athletes in the world, and actually I'm going to move that over, the top 0.001% in the world, because that's like where Luke Parker is. That's where some of these top cyclists are. Like, they're not just like the best in the, like they are the,
Yeah, they're not just like kind of the best. They're like very much like top 50.
It's top 50
in the whole world. Out of how many people are there? 7 billion or whatever.
right.
You have a big
Yeah. So when we look at that and we see that their training programs are dialed in, they're not skipping workouts. They're very focused. Their nutrition is locked in. Their sleep is locked in. It's tracked. They have like the best sleep that they can get. They have a team that's helping them in all aspects of human performance. Like they're hitting all of these things extremely well. So if I can get that extra 1%, because I've already built all these other things up, I can get that 1 extra percent, and it's just by slugging some sodium bicarbonate.
Yeah,
like
that's fair.
That makes sense, right? Taking a little bit of having some caffeine before going out to perform, like that makes sense, right? And when you get to that level of competition, everybody's looking for that little bit of performance edge, right? Like in the cycling world, like doping with erythropoietin and some of these other things that are banned. Like people are willing to do things that are even banned to get that performance effect because of how competitive they are.
Yeah.
So now, like most athletes agree that, like, no, I don't want to do anything that's illegal or on a banned substance list because that's cheating, and I don't want my legacy to be that of a cheater. So what if I use supplements that have science behind them that could potentially give me that 1 to 3% performance increase, and it's not on a banned substance list? But for the majority of athletes that are not in that top 0.0001%, man, there's so many other things we can take care of before we get to a supplement that we're really not sure what the effect is. And again, that's why I kept saying earlier, at first glance.
Yeah.
Because at first glance, you look at the science, and the science will show that there is an ergogenic performance effect, right? But then you dive further into the science, and this research article in 2023 that was really well done, and it kind of questions it.
Yeah.
Like, was it actually really done? There's huge inconsistencies. There's a lot of methodological flaws. And just because it's been researched for a while doesn't mean that it's been researched well.
Yeah.
And with that being said, if it's not researched well, then like, why use it? Or when do we use it?
Right. And how credible is that research?
Right. And then in that too, we look at like, well, what are the potential side effects? If I take this supplement and it may give me a 1 to 3% performance gain, but if it doesn't do that, could it have harm? Like, could it hurt my performance?
Right.
And with sodium bicarbonate, I'm laughing because it's funny. One of the side effects is GI disturbances. And one study looked significantly and reported that when subjects used sodium bicarbonate, there was a significant difference in burping, compared to people that didn't use it.
Like they burp more.
They burp more during performance when using it.
That's so funny.
And with that being said, like that's the biggest, like we talked about ergogenic and mentioned ergolytic. Like ergolytic is something that hurts your performance. So the ergolytic part of sodium bicarbonate is GI disturbing, in the sense of vomiting, GI distress, abdominal discomfort.
No one wants to be doing burpees and like actual burping
while
doing
it. So what's interesting is this GI disturbance, it's thought to be mitigated by that dosage that we said earlier, the 0.2 to 0.3 gram per kilogram. But the other way it is that like people are using it before the competition. Like they're kind of loading their body with it, not in the sense of like a creatine load phase, but they're just like having it beforehand to see what is the amount that I don't get GI disturbance with, and how long do I need to take it before I feel the performance effect, because of how variable it's been in the research. So if you have a competition this weekend and you've never put sodium bicarbonate in your drink, it's not the time to do it.
Would not recommend.
But if it's like, hey, I've done all the other building blocks of human performance, and I think that I could potentially get that increase of 1 to 3% performance by supplementing with this, and I want to mitigate the ergolytic effects, well, okay, maybe I'll start loading little bits of this and see like how do I feel with it. But I thought it was very funny that they reported a significant difference of burping in subjects that had the sodium bicarbonate versus subjects who didn't have the sodium bicarbonate.
I wish one of us had like a burp queued up and could just like belch really loud right now.
Right.
Shall we, anything else on this subject before we dive into quick hope stories?
I think to wrap it up, I just want to make the point clear. Just because something has research for a long time does not mean that it's been well done. And we don't need to jump on the next supplement train. And just because we see the top level athletes taking something doesn't mean that that's exactly what we should be taking, given the other examples that we laid out of all the other things that they're doing that would allow that sodium bicarbonate to be a 1 to 3% effect, right? Because like if your training program is trash and we can improve your training program, you're going to get a lot bigger of a gain than 1 to 3% on performance. If your sleep is also trash and we can improve your sleep and your recovery, you're going to get a much bigger performance effect than 1 to 3%. If you're not getting enough calories that you need to sustain the movements that you're doing, if you're not having carbs and you're an athlete that is using this anaerobic glycolytic system repetitively in competition, probably should be eating some carbs.
Yeah.
And by having that, you're going to get more than a 1 to 3% increase in performance. If you have all of these things, okay, now we can start having the conversation and we can start to experiment and say, what does the performance do for you as an individual? But there's a lot of steps that we can take care of and we can take control of before we start going to that. So know that, yeah, you don't have to start slammed in sodium bicarbonate. As more research comes out, now that there is this other area of the research showing this is how it should be blinded. Like we should be using capsules that are coated so that they can't see the color of it and they're not able to, again, taste that salty bitterness, and they're not able to kind of figure out like which one am I having, because it's human nature when a person is in these research studies, they want to know. They can't know, but they're trying to figure out, am I in the performance group that's getting this thing, or am I in the placebo group, right? Like they're trying to figure this out, and if they think that they're receiving the treatment, then they're going to start to behave in a way that they had the treatment because the brain works by prediction. So I think the trend of what we're seeing with the performance effects will likely change. And I will say right now, it does show that there's an ergogenic effect, given the research that's out there. But as the research starts to change and look at this different way of blinding, we may see that change. So although it's showing that it does have beneficial effect right now, it doesn't mean that it will show that in the next 10 years. If you hit all the other factors and you're looking for that 1 to 3% gain in performance, and you found the dose that allows you to not have GI disturbances where you're not farting or burping during the competition, then it might be a good thing to do. But again, like be curious and open-minded as this stuff comes out. I always lean towards like perception is powerful and thoughts are powerful. And I don't know if we need to take extra things in order to help us with performance. I mean, granted, like we need carbs, we need nutrition, we need protein, we need fats. But a lot of these other things that we're seeing is like sports enhancements. It's really the power of the thought of this happening. So
it's like Mike's secret stuff.
Yeah, we talked about it in the book of like a Gatorade bottle slapped with Michael's secret stuff on it, and they think they're drinking the super juice, and they go out in the second half and it won't spoil it, but the performance changes. And it was just water.
Space Jam, baby.
And so the question I have for our listeners is, what's keeping you from trying to dive into that? Not Michael's secret stuff, but looking and saying, wow, thoughts are really powerful. And my thoughts can change my interaction with my performance. And my thoughts can change the way I express these different movements. So what if we bypass some of this stuff and go right to the source and say, hey, let's change that. Let's update that and then see the performance.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Hope stories?
Hope stories. And if anyone has studied exercise science, the Krebs cycle, in which pyruvate goes down and then is like mobilized to create more ATP through that. Like we had to memorize that in exercise science and label the different parts. I'm with you. I'm sorry. It hurts the brain, just Krebs cycle. It gives you nightmares as an exercise scientist. And that's why we didn't dive into it so much. But I just want to throw that in there. Shout out to anyone that has had to memorize the Krebs cycle.
All right, then.
Yep.
My hope story is quick. We were at a local CrossFit event, having a booth and a table, sharing our book and our messaging and all of that. And I had the opportunity to just like chat with somebody while watching the competition. And it was somebody from the gym of one of the athletes. So like there was a man who was competing. His wife was there to support him, and then this girl was like friends with them, and they all go to the same gym. And I was just so encouraged because she was watching their baby so that the wife could go cheer on her husband.
Oh.
And so she was like holding the baby, and I was just like, it's a really simple hope story, but I was really encouraged to see one, the commitment of bringing, I mean, I don't think this baby was more than like 8-9 months old. So like the commitment of bringing like a baby to the CrossFit competition, the commitment to be working out with like a newborn baby, but then also just like the supportive community of like, hey, let me take your baby and like entertain this baby so that you can go and cheer on your husband and support your husband, and so that your husband can compete. Like I was just like, this is awesome. I was really encouraged to see that.
Oh, that's awesome. The support system. And then like thinking too of like the impact of that over time.
Yeah.
Of like a kiddo seeing their parent compete in something.
Yes.
Versus the like, well, my knees are a little bad.
Yeah.
I can't run anymore or squat anymore.
I've had a bad back since high school.
Yeah. I can't throw that ball around anymore.
Yeah.
But like seeing the person competing, seeing them in action, doing that just shows like this new wave of longevity. That we're saying that again is not supplement based.
Yeah.
It is movement based. It is spiritually based. It is all those other factors. So my hope story is a two-parter, but I'm going to share one part on this one.
Okay.
And then the second part on our next episode.
All right.
So my first part of the hope story is we recently went on a trip to Raleigh and got to see our best friends, got to see his clinic, his business, their babies. It was just incredible. But a gift that they got us was a 3-hour pass to a America Ninja Warrior type gym.
Yeah.
And it was awesome because it was on a Monday. And so it was like Brandy and I and maybe a few other
Less
kids,
than 10
but
people.
like basically it felt like you had the park to yourself. So we just got to go like wild
For
in
3
this
hours.
place for 3 hours. So my hope story is that like, do we train Ninja Warrior stuff? No. But we have a level of general physical preparedness that allowed us to fully enjoy the 3 hours at this facility.
Yeah.
You know, we're doing the salmon ladder, the warp wall. We did the slide that launches you in the air, and that one hurt. Like that one, you land and you kind of scorpion, land on your face. And I'm like, okay, I do need a little 5-minute rest from that. I fell from a few obstacles, but was able to like absorb the impact, get up and laugh and like, okay, let's do that again. I was on the salmon ladder. I'm like, hey, do I need a harness for this? And they're like, no, once you get up to like the 4th ring, I get up to the 5th one, go for the next one and missed it and then flat backed on every ground. But like this physical resilience that has been built up from general preparedness allowed this to be fun.
Yeah.
And another part in that is that the younger kids at one part, I was doing this one obstacle where, I don't know, you're up on this thing and you're doing a pull up and you reach for the next ring and you roll it and then it slides. And I'm just focused on trying to do this thing and trying not to slip off. And a little girl that was in the lane next to us, afterwards, Brandy was like, it was so cool that little girls have started cheering you on and doing that obstacle. So it doesn't even have to be, you know, your kids that you're setting an example for, but for like a younger kid to see an older guy like going for that, like that stuff is impactful. Yeah. And shows like now her brain at, I don't know how old she was.
I don't think she was more than 6.
But like 6 years old, seeing like, oh, and guess what? Like her dad was also doing the obstacles. Yeah. So now she's getting the example of what is possible. Yeah. And that's really cool. And then I'll share the other part of the hope story of great exposure and getting over some of our doubts. All right. At the American Ninja Warrior course in the next episode. All right. Yep. Awesome. Yep. Until then, have a great week. And remember, every day is not just an opportunity to be hopeful, but an opportunity to become hope.
The Hope Not Know podcast is meant for educational, informational, and personal development purposes only and does not constitute any health or medical advice. If you're looking for specific advice, connect with us to work with a Hope coach. Hope Not Note podcast shall not be liable or responsible for any loss or damage allegedly arising from any information or suggestions in this podcast.